Good evening, and welcome to Arts at 360. I'm your host, Scott Burton. Tonight's program is The Artist, a new program here on 360 North that reveals the life and work of Alaskan artists. Tonight, we're happy to have an artist who has unique roots here in Alaska. We'll look at his art and learn about how life in the state has affected his work. Note that we will be showing images and video that include nudity. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Woodie. Well, David, you probably don't want me to do this, but I would like to start by reading a bit of your resume and some awards that you've won. In '96, you won the All-Alaska Juried Art Exhibit Juror's Choice Award Best of Show at the Anchorage Museum of History and Art, right?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, '98, same award except the first place painting award.
Yeah.
Okay. In 2001, 2002, you were an Alaskan Artist Solo Exhibit at the Anchorage Museum of History and Art. In 2000, at the Bunnell Street Gallery in Homer. 1998, Alaska State Museum here in Juneau. 2004, Juneau Douglas City Museum. 2004-2005, Rasmussen Foundation Mid-Career Artist Fellowship. And 2014, juror this year at the University of Alaska Anchorage Studio Exhibit, and the list goes on. So you're no stranger to art in Alaska, are you?
Not at all.
And again, that list does go on. I'd like you to start by telling us about your history in art as it relates to Alaska. Where did this all begin and how did you get here?
All right, so I think I began when I had a friend in the first grade who drew dinosaurs, and I absolutely loved it. So I drew ships, is what I kind of picked on, and I loved all the little rigging and everything. And I continued to pursue art pretty obsessively when I was really young. And by the time I was about 12, my mother was single and didn't know what to do with me really, and kind of introduced me to the director of the art department at the University of Oregon. And he was a great guy. He really helped me out a lot. I was a little bit rudderless at the time, and he kind of opened the door to his studio, or to his office, and allowed me to just come in there and shoot the breeze with him anytime I wanted to. Yeah, and he was great. I mean, he would take time off any time and just hang out with me, and it really helped me a lot. And I continued to kind of wheedle my way into classes there at the University of Oregon, and up until the mid-'60s or so, until I think it was about 14 or so, and I continued doing art until I was about in my late teens, and this was the late '60s, so it was kind of chaotic, and I couldn't really make any plans. And so I had a little issue with the draft and things like that. So, so I kind of expected to go to jail for a couple of years as my introduction to adulthood. So I didn't really, I kind of wandered around for a couple of years after I left home, and then I finally wound up back in Oregon and realized I liked the place, and ever since then it's been kind of a slow migration northward. But I really couldn't make a living doing art at that point, so I went to work in the woods. And
your grandfather was a logger, right?
Oh yeah, my family, a lot of my grandfather's family had 9 brothers and a sister, and it was a big old Oregon farm family, and most of them were loggers at one time or another during their lives. My grandfather was a logger and a placer miner. He worked with Henry Speaker actually up on the Steese Highway at a Miller House on North Fork of Harrison Creek. They had a placer mine up there. And it's kind of a long history for me. I've always had really ambivalent feelings about logging, but I always wanted to give it a whirl, just to see what it was like.
And you were logging in Oregon, and then didn't a job come available up in Alaska, and didn't you get trapped here somehow? Well,
what happened was I was working with a big worker-owned cooperative, a big, kind of a anarchist collective sort of organization that we contracted forestry work all over the western United States, and it really expanded really rapidly right after I joined. And we bid a job at Edna Bay, a pre-commercial thinning job, and we really wanted to go to Alaska, so we bid pretty low. And I didn't really make enough money to get back to Oregon. So I went over to the other side of the island and went to work in a logging camp there, a place called Cape Pole. It was owned by LOG Logging Company at the time, which was, everybody said that LOG stood for Lawrence and Olson and God.
And is that when you started to meet guys like this?
Yeah, actually, this was another outfit that I worked for. I worked for quite a few different outfits around there, and this one I would think could be fairly, with all due respect, could be described as a rat trap camp. This is an old Washington, I think that's either a 125 or a 127. I think it's a 127 because it has air frictions. I think the 125 has hand frictions, but it's on an A-frame float, and we were A-frame logging, just the three of us. And we did that for, I think, for a winter and most of a summer, something like that, in that particular outfit.
You remember those guys' names?
Oh yeah, that's Barney Belk in the front there. I think he still lives down on Marble Island. And Lewis, I can't remember Lewis's last name. He was running yarder back there.
And you told me that when you got back into logging, you weren't necessarily making art right when you got back in, but you were already seeing images. You saw stuff you wanted to paint.
Yeah, I thought there was a lot of compelling imagery around me all the time. I think when you really get, if you really pursue art, you begin to see things that way all the time. And I saw that all the way, for the total of about 17 or 18 years that I worked in the woods. I kept thinking, well, this would make a great painting, and this would make a great painting, and this, you know. So ultimately, when I did go back to it, it was sort of like a big relief, you know. But see, I mean, to me, this is really dramatic stuff, and it's full of all kinds of metaphors, and I think metaphors that you could read in a lot of different ways. So that's something I like, you know.
What's one way that somebody might read one of the metaphors?
Oh, I don't know. There's a three-part composition there that rhymes with a lot of religious stuff. I'm surprised. I've never hardly been in a church, but I keep finding kind of traditional Christian themes, medieval Christian themes, cropping up in my artwork.
Not to mention the one behind you.
Well, yeah. There is an apple with a bite out of it there, isn't there?
There is.
And I guess we're not in the garden anymore, so.
And speaking of characters.
Oh yeah. This was Tom Austin. He's dead now, but he did live to be 75 years old, which is a miracle. And this is, you're familiar with this painting. I think this is hanging over your piano right now.
Yep, I love it.
I think the easiest thing to point out there is the hand of cards that you see above the figure there. And that pretty much sums up my feeling about tramp logging, which is, it's kind of like a busted flush, which is so close to being perfect, but really it's not worth let me see, what's the word I can use here? It's not worth anything.
It's sort of the logging life.
It's not worth a fiddler's, or not worth a tinker, or something. You know.
Chainsaw's chain, I don't know.
But I mean, I loved it, and you know how it is when somebody gets a busted flush in a poker game, particularly a drunk young choker setter. You just can't fold, you know, because it's so close to being perfect, you know. You just can't. They'll always try to bluff, you know. That's the way I used to make my money on the weekends.
And not to mention the beautiful landscape in the back. You just nail that sort of glacially carved fjord. You got those lines, but you're going to add a clear cut as well. Because
yeah,
that's
it's a little modified by people. I think that although it's such a harsh view, it's something that really says a lot about people and striving, and maybe a little bit about greed, and maybe a little about work, and all of those things. So this one belongs to the State Museum now, and it's a circular composition, or a kind of a spiral composition, to where this logging road begins way off in the distance there. This is down by Craig. It's Port St. Nicholas, and that would actually be, it's all been switched around a little bit to make the painting work, but that would be San Juan Bautista Island in the distance there with the clouds. And that logging road comes forward down the shore of Port St. Nicholas and out of the picture frame and back down here. And then it kind of loops around with the hand a little bit. And for me, that was just, you know, I have found myself coming back to this place of walking down one of these roads without any clear idea of exactly where I'm going. You know, it's something that I've come back to over and over in my life, and so that's why I did the spiral thing.
And what might somebody
This
think
is the
of
one
the
that got the
flashlight?
painting award in Anchorage.
Okay. What might somebody think of the flashlight?
Well, I'm not sure, actually. There's been a number of different interpretations that have come up in the, there was this, wasn't a word in Anchorage, so there was a thing in the paper about it, and one person saw it as being shining a light on the effects of clear cutting. I don't know, I suppose that could be, but I don't know. To me, it's just sort of, I think if I was to try to pin it down, I'd say it's sort of a metaphor for the kind of direction of your consciousness. So it's, you have a, you know, a small focus of your conscious mind and all of this huge world of less conscious things.
Okay. I want to talk about narrative painting here in a minute, but first I would like to see where you do this.
Sure.
Let's take a look into David Woodie's studio. What do you think?
Yeah. I kicked all the wine bottles into the corner for you. So. I've had some of the best times of my life in here, that's for sure. I tend to come in sometime in the mid-afternoon and stay until usually around 9 or 10, something like that, and then stumble on home. I moved in here, I think in 2000. I had been painting in a house before that. I was married at the time, and that was a little bit difficult for my wife, along with the rest of being an artist was also difficult for her. But that, you know, painting in the house with the solvents and with the mess associated with it and the way it kind of takes over a room, that didn't really work. So she talked me into renting this place, and this has been absolutely great. This easel setup that I have here, it's kind of a mess right now, but it's really kind of a mess almost all the time, really. And every now and then I should probably scrape that off, but I don't get around to it that much. But it's 8 by 8. I can get a pretty big canvas on there, or I can get 2 or 3 up there at the same time. I can work on a diptych or a triptych all at the same time, which is pretty useful. Or I can get a big painting on there, and that really does help too. And this way I can work on 2 or 3 of them at a time, and I can kind of pop from one to the other. Like most oil painters, you know, I have to wait for periods of time while something dries and work on something else for a while. So I usually have 4 or 5 things going at once. Right now I probably have a dozen things going at once, but got a platform here for the model, which I've set up with a black background so I can you know, judge color and value a little bit better. Got a rack full of paintings over there and a whole wall full of paintings over here, and that's pretty much it, other than all the junk that's jammed in all the cracks between those things. It's kind of, this is, I would say this is mid mess here. It gets worse and it gets better, but it's usually not too much different than this.
Cool. That was a lot of fun to make. I got to spend some time with David Woodie in the studio.
That was fun. That was a really good time.
And we have another one coming up in a minute of David in the classroom, so looking forward to that one as well. Tell us about this one, David.
This, I think, this is a fairly old painting, but I think it's really one of the more successful ones for me, and it's a really personal painting for me. This guy let me see, it would be on your right here. He is an old friend of mine. I've known him since I was probably 15 years old, and we moved to Alaska together and worked in the woods together quite a bit, and both in Oregon and western U.S. and also in Alaska. And that's his daughter when she was really young. And the landscape is more or less, like I say, I usually change these things around to make them work for the painting, but that's dog salmon, or it's Big Salt Bay near Craig. And that's Alaska land, and once again, you know, the logging, I think really people tend to write themselves on the landscape with that, and the toughness of that way of life and the harshness of it and everything is all really kind of written into that landscape. was a really fun landscape to paint, and to this day, it's really, I think, one of the better landscapes I've ever done. And I like the simplicity of it, of just the two faces and the landscape work together pretty well.
And this one, that chair was actually on the log, right?
Yeah, it was sitting on top of the stump there, and this was in a place right outside of Kloak, actually. Something I've noticed all my life is that people tend to find these places right outside of town, usually places that have been transformed by some kind of industrial activity, and that's where they go to misbehave. And that's where the chair, you can't really see in this small reproduction, but the chair is full of bullet holes, and this is where you go to drink and shoot your gun, and there's garbage in the woods, and there was actually a big car battery right underneath that stump, and I wanted to get it in. I couldn't really make it work with the composition, but it was a die-hard battery, and then I would have titled this, instead of Shinnecoe Spur Bloodyfoot, I would have titled it Die Hard Lazy Boy, which would be a really good title. I'd like to make another painting just to go with that title.
Brain Bucket.
Brain Bucket, which I think is pretty self-explanatory, but I've always thought of this one as something that you could use as a standard. You could carry this in an atheist religious procession. If there was such a thing.
Atheist religious procession.
Yeah. This one, I have to photograph them together like that, but what I really intended with this diptych was that one of these images would be in one room and the other would be in another room, or that they would be on either side of a doorway or in either side of a room or something like that, so that somewhat, every other time you look at it, the truck's zooming by, So, you would kind of, if you weren't familiar with the building, you might look at it and say, well, wait a second, I didn't remember there was a truck in there. That's lunch right there. I ate lunch in places like that quite a lot. And that's my old thermos up there. I ended up using, some of the paintings you'll see have space cells in them, and I use that term pretty loosely. It comes from Persian miniature painting, where they will have little squares and geometrical shapes off to the side of an image that show a different time and place. And people always ask me, why is the thermos and the coffee mug and the sandwich floating above this, because people tend to see it as a rational image, but I don't at all. I mean, I've been working on this two-dimensional thing, so I know that it's just painted on top of the other image. But I decided as a result of that to use different strategies for combining images rather than having them look like they're, like this lunch is floating over the stump,
So I would like to read this piece, something that you've said once. Mm-hmm. I've lived all my life around old-growth logging in the Pacific Northwest. Many of my relatives had been loggers. The impact of human activity on nature has always fascinated me, and I have very ambivalent feelings about it. On one hand, the destruction can be appalling. On the other, this is the landscape of my earliest memories. The powerful feelings this landscape evokes in me is a huge influence on my work. The entire time I worked in the woods, I saw the landscape through the painter's eyes. Hard work is a form of meditation, and when my head was cleared of thoughts and opinions and politics, I found myself responding to this destruction on the edge of wilderness as a poignantly beautiful thing. Destruction, loss, and rebirth, all written on the landscape.
Yeah. Did I write that?
You said that. It's interesting to think about how some people see logging, a lot of people think about destruction, but for you, you have mixed emotions, you have background there. It was a very formative time for you.
Yeah, when I was a kid, things weren't going well around the house. My mother used to like to throw us in the car and go for a drive on a logging road, and we drove through landscapes like this for miles and miles and miles. Yeah. At that time, the Coast Range in Oregon was being pretty heavily extracted, and that was sort of where people went to do things like that, as well as shoot their guns and drink the beer and throw the can in the bushes. This one is titled Vanitas O'Donnell River, which identifies roughly the place where the landscape is, but it's I've done a lot of kind of takes on the old Vanitas theme, which is a meditation on the brevity of life and beauty. And in this, each thing in that image has some relation to time. The grass is annual, the pine trees are 100 years, the mountain is geological time, the clouds and the smoke are really ephemeral. But also the twist on the Vanitas theme that I wanted to put in here was that, a lot of times in a Vanitas painting they'll have a candle burning down, which is a sort of a passive way of seeing, the span of a person's lifetime. But I kind of like a cigarette better as a metaphor because you consume it,
Right.
You smoke it right down to the butt, which is what you do with your life, And this is a landscape over by Atlin, also near the O'Donnell River as well. This is by Surprise Lake, actually, and that's a semi-reclaimed placer mine. And Boulder Creek is what you see in the distance. Once again, if you're familiar with Boulder Creek, you may not recognize it because I've changed everything around to make it work in the composition. But you can see there's been placer mining all the way up that stream. And this is something that's part of my family history. And I think, like logging, it really does kind of write that striving and, and those parts of human nature on the landscape. And the interpenetration of human nature and non-human nature you see everywhere here in the cartoon squirrel and the squirrel peanut butter and the steer, which is probably the ultimate interpenetration of human and non-human nature. And the can of McEwen Strong Ale, which, just belongs there.
Well, David, we are running out of time, and I want to show the video of you teaching.
Yeah.
And who's this?
This is Jane Terza. She was my good friend, teacher, and mentor, and I learned a million things from her. She was really great to me when I first came here to do this.
A couple of her images here.
Yeah.
And let's take a look at what you do in the classroom.
All right.
They've got it kind of stylized, so it really does kind of look like her. But her face, if you put a line up there, it's pretty vertical. See her pencil? It's, you go, good. It's from her chin to her forehead. It's just
In a
really,
school
really
like
vertical.
this, which is an open admission school, and there are people here for all kinds of different reasons. I can't really. This is not like a high-tone art academy where you can really lay down the law. I don't really have a stick. All I've got is a carrot. So the best thing I can do is to try to make friends with them, and really, try to get a rapport going with them, so that they can approach what a lot of them don't realize is probably the most difficult thing they'll ever try to learn to do.
Try to figure out how that lines up with this stuff. If I hold my pencil right like that.
At least the core of the students in the class are, they're artists and I'm an artist, and we kind of are doing this together. One of the greatest things about the whole job has been that, if I am having some kind of an issue with my own art, I bring that to the class, and if they're having issues with their art, they bring it to the class, and so we're all kind of, it's a little bit more like a collective than a class in a way, because I learn as much from them as they learn from me.
I think the thing that I like the most is he's always really aware of when people are ready for critique versus when they're still in progress. So, he makes his rounds around the class, but he definitely gives you time to work on your drawing. And when he comes back around, he'll stand there for a second, and then you kind of are able to welcome him into whatever you're doing. And he's always very constructive with his feedback. So
Give you the standard lecture that you should really have, especially since this is going to be such a big part of the drawing, the shape of her hair. You should get that in there before you get any more little details, little hand details or wrist details or anything like that. You want to work on the whole thing all at once, or you will find that there'll be problems.
And with art, I don't know why it is. It's a really peculiar thing, but people take it to heart. And if you make a harsh judgment of a person's artwork, you're making a harsh judgment of the person. And it can be pretty tough for a person. So I try to be really careful not to, to be too harsh. And I also try to keep it practical, I try to tell them, hey, that ear is a little high, or maybe you should make that nose a little longer, or the eye should be a little closer to the nostril. And I'll stand with them and look at the model and their drawing and talk it over.
He's very, he sets a good tone with the artists about the limits of modeling and how to approach the model. And he also has a really good perspective on the whole idea of nudity for art, and that makes it easy to not wear a robe in front of 12 different people, and because it's all art oriented, and he's really interactive with the students and casual with me in conversation while I'm modeling, and yeah, it's really fun being in class because everybody has a good time, I feel like.
I don't have any commitment to realism or anything like that. I don't really consider myself a realist painter in any meaningful sense, but that's something I can help people with. I can't make you more or less creative, but I can help you to learn to draw. You know, I think really you don't teach people to draw, you teach them how to teach themselves how to draw. Art is really always fundamentally self-taught. You know, it's not like math where you can really, you know, where there's a beginning and a middle and an end. It's really a pretty complex process, and it's really subjective. And success is really subjective, and failure is really subjective. So, I like that piece. Megan is so adorable. Sweet kid.
So remind us how long you've been teaching?
I think it's either 22 or 23 semesters now. I'm not sure. It's around 10 or 11 years. I think I'm on my 11th year, I believe, something like that. It might be the 12th even, I'm not sure. Since 2003.
Okay.
I'm not very good with math.
And let's go back to the idea of 7 winters, because it relates to teaching. And when you went back to school from logging, tell us about that.
I kind of looked around myself at a certain point. I'd been working in the woods for quite some time. I'd been logging for about 13 years, worked in the woods altogether for 17 or 18 years. And everybody I knew that had worked in the woods for that period of time had some kind of life-changing injury or some kind of major social pathology. I only have minor ones, but it looked like, you know, the trajectory of most people's lives around me was not that appealing. And so I kind of thought I would do something inside. And I had, all that time I'd worked in the woods, I had really been thinking about returning to painting. And so I finally decided to do it and moved to Juneau. And I had a girlfriend here, and I was working for a logging company that went broke. And I got I think a $900 tax return that year, and I thought,
Nice.
It was pretty easy to bail. And that it was a good thing, because that company went down in flames. I think the owner was in federal prison by the time the dust had settled. So Jippo loggers, if those of you are familiar with Jippo loggers, they usually go down hard. So that kind of convinced me to come here, and I took classes from Jane when I first came here, and she became a really good friend and really helped me a lot and introduced me to a lot of other artists, both artists in Alaska as well as other artists with national reputation that I had not known of before. And I think that's really, really helpful for an artist. You know, you have to kind of look around at what people are doing and get an idea of what you want to do. And that was super, super helpful for me. So.
And that's when you started fishing in the summer, right?
Yeah, I bought a little hand troller, and I hand trolled all summer. And then I would go longlining with a friend of mine on the Tommy L2 in the spring, generally. Sometimes a little bit in the fall, but mostly in the spring. And that kind of got me through, you know. There's a fisherman out there.
So speaking of fishing, and maybe we can talk a little bit about narrative painting with this
Sure.
piece.
Well, narrative painting goes back a long ways. And obviously, any image, any painting is going to have some kind of element of narrative to it. But consciously, when people consciously approach narrative painting, in the past it's usually been history painting or biblical stories or things like that. Generally paintings that illustrate a story that existed before the painting. But in the middle of the 19th century, people began to say, modernists began to say, well, art should be about art and not about some other story. That's basically applied art. That's illustration to tell a story like that in a painting. And so narrative painting pretty much disappeared for a period of time, but surrealists kind of kept it alive. Now, my stuff is not surrealism, and I don't like to see it kind of regarded in that way, because as surrealism, it's not very good surrealism. But as narrative painting, I hope it would do a little better. And nowadays, I think from the influence of surrealism, narrative painters tend to make a painting that evokes a story. And I think most artists these days like to keep that story as open-ended as possible. Try to keep the narrative circle open a little bit so that you can bring yourself to the painting. So I show the boat, which was painted from a photograph that I took out fishing on the Tommy 2. That's the roller there and the trolling pole and some of the rigging and the valves, hydraulic valves. And I painted that first, but I put a linen patch on the top of there when I was building the support. I put a linen patch on the top of there so I'd have a smoother area over there. And then I waited until I was done painting the rest of it to decide what to put in there. And since it was so male and so phallic looking, I thought it should have maybe a little yin-yang thing there. And the way it turns out is I think any man who's ever fished knows exactly what that's about, and I don't need to explain a thing. So.
Well said.
That's called Beast, and I'm going to leave it up to you who's the beast here. If the shark is the beast, it's a former beast, because that's a dead shark. But I think one of the things about commercial fishing, people tend to see it as being such an idyllic life, but on a good day, you're ankle deep in guts, you know, and it's a kind of a brutal job, really. I spent a lot of my time kind of doing jobs like that people will pay you fairly well for if will put up with the misery and get with the knife.
I know that you like to draw from real life whenever possible and paint from real life. I'm assuming you must have taken a photo of this.
This took about 4 or 5 different photos actually, and I kind of combined them together. And then the hand was painted from life. The little knife blade was painted from life. A lot of these are combinations like that that are put together out of a lot of different images.
Why is it that you like to draw from real life?
Well, because you're actually engaging with something real. In this case, with that model, you know, it's entirely different working from a photograph. You can't talk to the photograph. The photograph doesn't giggle, you know. You don't have any human interaction at all. And also, a photograph, cameras still to this day tend to bully people quite a lot. You know, you see the photograph, you always measure the painting against the photograph, which, you know, the photograph has to live by entirely different standards than the painting has to live by. They're really different things. A painting is a record of every time you touch that canvas with a brush, every time you smear it with your finger, you make a series of decisions. So the result is thousands upon thousands upon thousands of decisions, many, many, many more than there are pixels in that image, reflecting the fundamental nature of the artist that built it. So it's really a signature kind of a thing. And it's entirely different than just a record of how light falls on an object, you know. And you know, I like to change things. I don't like to feel like the photograph is telling me how it should be, you know. So this one's comprised from actually some drawings and sketches, paintings, and things that I did up on the Taylor Highway. There's a big burn up there. There was a couple of years back when about I think 6 million acres burned along the border of Yukon and Alaska, and this was one of those burns. I think it's on the Taylor Highway, and I think it's about 85 miles across, and a little bit longer. I think it's probably closer to 150 miles long. An immense fire, and there's this sense with these fires that they're kind of a judgment on us. In a way, we sort of brought them on ourselves somehow.
Did you hear that on the radio or something when you were?
Well, I was listening to a religious station, a preacher at a station out of Tok, and it was a real, you know, fire and brimstone, apocalyptic, really American apocalyptic preaching, and driving through that landscape. They really went together well, and I thought that, you know, also the idea of the two massive forces of nature, you know, that are both creative and destructive.
And this is also called Vanitas?
Yes, this is Vanitas 40 Mile.
Okay.
It was fun learning to paint flames. That was really, I looked to Sidney Goodman for that. Anybody wants to paint flames, look to Sidney Goodman. Google him up. not enough Americans know about Sidney Goodman. He's a great American painter. This one is titled Seattle Riff, Don't Judge Me, Old Man, because this model was working for me at one point, and we were in the middle of a project, and she shaved her head, and I guess it's sort of a rite of passage for young women these days. Everybody's got to do that once or twice. But I kind of got a little stoked at her because we were right in the middle of this project, and of course I felt really bad about that, and I had to go find her and apologize all over the place. And but now, whenever she shaves her head or dyes her hair some bizarre color or something, she always makes sure to send me a picture. So, so this one was actually from Portland, I think, but I just blended it right into the Seattle Riff. One of the things I like to do, and this is a traditional thing for narrative painters, is to create a great big void like that and then put things in it. And these are all things that rhyme with Seattle in one way or another for me. And the big spots are, I had a photograph of that background that I took from the top of the Space Needle, and it's the Olympic Mountains and Puget Sound. And I was walking down to my studio, and it was raining, and I got water on the thing, and it made those little blotch things. So I noticed how you couldn't see them as being all on one plane. They looked like they were all at different depths. You just can't put them on a flat plane. And that's one of the things I like to play with formally is the illusion of space and how you can fool around with that.
Okay. Will you talk to us a little bit about the nuts and bolts of painting?
Sure.
We saw the video from your studio. Tell us about how it goes from A to B.
Well, for me, it's a kind of a complicated process. It's gotten more and more complicated over the years, but it's really it's less complicated than it sounds when I describe it. In this particular case, I would have stretched a fairly coarse canvas over a wooden support. The wooden support is usually I use a Luan plywood underlayment, which has one smooth side on it, so I can glue canvas down to that with waterborne polyurethane, and that makes the canvas hard. It makes it bulletproof, so I can scrape or really brush hard on it or rub paint into it or anything I want without worrying about stretched canvas like this. You can't work it really, really hard, and you can't glue things on top of it or anything like that, or it just will start coming apart after a period of time. So I get the thing solidly glued down with waterborne polyurethane, and then I put the ground on, which is gesso. It's a polymer emulsion mixed with gypsum, and that makes it white. And I put 2 or 3 coats of that on there. I tend to like to make a rough surface and then try to smooth it out as much as I can. Yeah. Something like, I don't know, it's a weird little engine that you use to drive the process. But this was a pretty rough burlap, and I smoothed it down as much as I could, and then painted this landscape on top of it. And before I start painting the imagery at all, once it's just a white canvas, I'll usually put a red or a reddish brown imprimatura on it, which is just to tone the canvas. So if you try to judge value, relative lightness or darkness or color against a white background, it's pretty hard to judge because it's backlit. And likewise, if it was a black canvas, it'd be hard to judge value. It would seem lighter than it really is. So you use a mid-tone, and also I use this reddish brown because it seems to work with anything, with a human figure, with a landscape, with just about anything. There's always a little of that red in it, and it gives the painting an overall color unity as well. So then I'll usually start out with a limited palette and do basically a value study, which shows all the areas that are going to be light and dark, and a little bit of color in there, usually like 4 colors, so I have light, dark, and warm and cool. And once I've got all that figured out, then I can go on and glaze in a lot of more high chroma color and more different colors. The green comes the very last, because when you look at nature, the green is on the surface of things, and the red is underneath. So that's Westport over by Hoona. It's a pretty straight representation of the way it looked at the time. Where the smoke is coming from is the last place I ever worked in the woods. The last logging job I had was there at Westport. That's the same model that had the red hair on the other picture. And this is a little tiny painting. This is just before she shaved her head, actually. That's a small portrait, actually. And this was done a little bit different process than I usually use. I was using, rather than using a hot red glaze and then painting into it with cool colors, I was actually using a cool gray glaze, which is translucent paint. You know, it's paint that's mixed with more oil and varnish so that it makes it a little glossier and more translucent. And I'll paint that over there and then paint into it with heavier paint, and that's where I get the color from. So this one went from basically a gray underpainting to just a little bit of red added on top of it, because I wanted that kind of cool look.
What's this one called?
This one's called Hochtaheen for Warren and Mary. I was a little smitten by this model, and I was talking to her in the studio while we were working on this, and it turned out that her grandparents were friends of mine, which was a little bit of a wet blanket, really, you know. It sort of destroyed the mood a little bit, but they owned the hook shop out at Elfin Cove for a long time. They had kind of a still situation there where there's a particular rock there, right near Gaff Rock. There's a big reef that the bottom goes from 54 fathoms to 4 fathoms, and like that, with just like an overhang or something. And your introduction to that place, there's a real strong tide around there, so everybody's introduction to that place is to lose all your gear on that rock, and away you go to the hook shop. And,
Yeah.
But they were her grandparents, and and actually, the water behind there was taken from a photograph that I have of the anchorage at Hochtaheen, and that's where her parents, or both her grandparents and some of other relatives and friends of hers fished out of there for a long time. Joe and I fish out of there quite a bit too. I think Joe says he's spent more time anchored up in Hochtaheen than any other single place he's ever been in his whole life.
Speaking of fishing, tell us about still life behind me.
This is actually, those of you who are fishermen, and particularly those of you who are longliners and use snap-on gear, will recognize that those are cod heads that are baited up with snap-on gear in a galvanized tub, and they're ready to be snapped on. That's a little bit of a desperate maneuver, you know, when we were running out of bait. And, it's a lot of work doing that, but they're good bait. Cod heads make really good bait. I had another painting very similar to this that had herring in there, and there was a herring baited on each hook. And I was going to have a show in Petersburg, and I wanted to have paintings there that would make the fishermen would be the insiders. They'd know what was going on in the painting, but all the art people would be lost, you know. So it didn't really work that well, actually. The criticism that you get from Petersburg fishermen was, a guy took me aside with the herring one, and he said, you know, you should be cutting your herring in half, you know. It's wasteful to bait a whole herring on there, you know. So that's the kind of issues that art issues that come up in Petersburg. So.
And this is the point in the slideshow where we sort of switch into portraiture. Tell us about drawing a portrait versus, say, drawing a piece like this. How do you approach them?
Well, I like to work from a model. I do use photographs in some of these. The one of the girl with the black hair was done from a photograph, but she was working for me at the time, and I saw her all the time. So that doesn't bother me, working from a photograph there. But generally, photographs, unless they're taken by really expert photographers, there's not that much information in the photograph. And particularly if you use a flash or anything like that, it just washes out all the shadows and everything. Plus, I like to talk to the model, and I like to respond to the model. There's a British painter who recently died, Lucian Freud, and he would have the model in the studio, even if he was painting the background, if he was painting the wall of the studio or anything, he always has the model there in the pose. And I am sympathetic with that idea because a room is different when that person is in the room and when they're not. And you really want to get that in the painting. So I like to have the person around. This one I worked on for quite a while after she left town. I think it was months. I was really kind of had to struggle with this one a little bit. This is painted in something very close to what would be called Flemish Technique, which is the original oil painting technique from Northern Europe, and done in layer after layer after layer of real thin glazes. Very little opaque paint in that. The white is the only opaque pigment in there at all. Everything else is pretty translucent.
And you talked to me earlier about a style that sort of set from the beginning. Was that the Flemish style? Or remind me, and then, you know, styles of painting evolved to where paintings could sort of go in their own direction. Talk about that a bit.
Flemish painting is pretty rigid. It's really hard to make corrections. You start with a really detailed underpainting, and then you just add color very slowly on top of that, and you add glaze on top of glaze, so it gives it a lot of depth. You can see that in the original. It's harder to see in a reproduction, but you can see in the original they have a lot of depth to them. But it's kind of a rigid style. So Venetian painters, really people like Titian, really wanted to have a little bit more flexible approach so that they could make changes in the, in mid-course in the painting, because every artist wants to do that at some point during the course of a painting. And if you can't, if you're using this fairly rigid technique, it's really constricting. So they started painting on large canvases. They found out that you could make a large flat surface with no seams in it with canvas, where the Flemish painting was all done on wood. And in those days, without plywood, you could only make fairly small supports. And they're even in the time that even at that time, they knew that the wood was ultimately going to split and have all kinds of problems with boring insects and various things. So canvas had a lot of advantages. It also could be taken off the stretcher and rolled up and transported. So that, as well as some modifications in the technique that make it it's simpler and easier to make changes in. And that pretty much came to dominate painting after that. The Flemish technique pretty well died out.
Wow.
This one was, I got a short beard there, don't I? This one was a few years ago, and I wanted to practice a technique that Rembrandt used, which was his addition onto the idea of Flemish painting. And he used, in the self-portraits that he did as an old man, he used Kremnitz white or flake white to create a kind of a texture for the skin. And then he would add a really thin glaze on top of that. And that translucent glaze is like stained glass in a way. So when light hits it, it goes through the glaze and reflects off of the white paint underneath and comes back to your eye. So it has a kind of a glowing sort of a quality to it. And he would scrape off, for highlights, he would scrape off down to the white paint underneath. And that's what I was practicing doing in this particular piece. So
You've referenced a lot of painters tonight, and when I was talking with some of your students, they were very thankful for all of the painters that you've introduced them to, either here in Alaska or classically, everything. Can you talk a little bit about that, why it's important to study the work of others?
Sure, it is really important, and there's been such an enormous amount of painting done over the years, and by so many different painters, that you really need to kind of see what other people have done and find a point of departure somewhere in that. For me, I love Baroque painting, and I've loved it ever since I was a kid. Even though
Baroque exaggerated?
It's theatrical, I think.
Yeah.
A lot of people think of Baroque as being highly ornamented, and that is characteristic of some Baroque painting, but more characteristic is the drama and theatricality of it. A lot of Baroque painting was begun as an attempt on the part of the Catholic Church to prevent the Reformation from coming across the Alps and down into Catholic country. And so they commissioned lots and lots of art depicting religious themes from a Catholic point of view. And some of this stuff was just absolutely dynamite. And I, as a kid, when I was first introduced to these things, I think probably in my dentist's office in an art book, I loved these things, and I had no idea what was going on in there. I was completely unfamiliar with Catholic theology and had no idea who any of these saints were or anything. I'd never, like I say, I've never hardly darkened the door of a church, but I loved that stuff, and I thought I loved the drama and the theatricality of it. And I think a lot of painters really look back to that period of time, because that's when painting was really at its height. We had the grand pictorial scale, which has sort of been stolen from us by movies now. But at that time, that was the only way to make a big image, and it was really thriving. And that part of it also I really like. I like the drama, and I like the idea of the grand pictorial scale. This is Gulf of Alaska. This is relates to a method that I've been trying to use to create an opening for the viewer to kind of inject themselves into the image. The story basically is I took a camera with me and a sketch pad when I went fishing in the summers, and I fished alone on a little tiny boat, and I think I spent too much time alone because toward the I'd take my camera along and I'd get the film developed, and toward the end of the season they were all these shots of, you know, a little bit of bleak ocean through a black little thing like this, you know, and like through the doorway of the wheelhouse is halfway through, it's black on this side and there's nothing out there, you know, and that sort of thing, and that was where this came from. The doll I've used over and over and over in lots of different images, and his name's Salvador, and but what I wanted to do here was to put the doll, which I think represents the person out there, and the seascape, stretch them as far apart as I could so that there's that gulf in the middle, that gap in the middle, which you sort of have to fill with something from yourself. And I've suggested the kind of bleakness of that isolation, being on a tiny boat in a vast expanse of water. And then you can decide for yourself how you would feel about being there.
And I've heard you talk about that as well. There was a point in time when painting got a lot more interesting, when painters decided they wanted the viewer to be involved with the painting.
Yeah.
They wanted them to finish the story.
Yeah. I think there was a great review written by the reviewer for the New Yorker about a Norman Rockwell show, and he explained how this one particular painting you may be familiar with, of a young woman, probably late teens, sitting in a slip in front of a mirror and looking at herself in the mirror. And on her lap, there's a movie magazine opened up like this. It's a Norman Rockwell painting. And if that magazine wasn't there, it would be something more like a narrative fine art painting. But with the magazine there, it becomes an illustration, because you know exactly what she's thinking. You know, he's closed the narrative like Norman Rockwell always did. Mm-hmm. So everything you need to know is in that picture, and it tells a story that's already exists. If the magazine wasn't there, you'd have to decide for yourself what that person was looking at. And that is much more what narrative painting is like these days for most narrative painters. There are still narrative painters who do mythological subject matter or classical subject matter of one sort or another. I like to inject that kind of stuff into my paintings, but I always like to try to keep the narrative as open as possible. You know, so that, I think for a lot of people of my generation, we were influenced not so much just by painters, but by singer-songwriters, and people like Bob Dylan. I've always been a big Bob Dylan fan. The song "It's All Over Now," Baby Blue. I've loved that song for 40 years, but I have no idea what it means, and I like that. I like for it to remain a mystery. You know, every time I hear it, it's a new thing. You know, it doesn't get old.
Well, David, we're coming to the end of our time today. Mm-hmm. Let's end on what's next for you.
Well, I'm going to keep teaching at the university for as long as I can, and I have a bunch of things going in my studio. Unfortunately, that great model is leaving town, so I'm going to have to scrape up a couple of new ones. But I got a couple of them lined up, so I think I'm in pretty good shape there. But I'm just going to keep doing this as long as I can, as long as I'm sucking air.
Well, I sure have enjoyed talking with you today.
Likewise, Scott. This has been really fun, the whole process.
Yeah. Let's do it again sometime.
Let's do. We'll do a time-lapse thing one of these days.
Yeah. Look at your art a lot.
You bet.
So that's all we have time for this evening. To see more of David's work, you can find him on Facebook. This and other 360 North programs are available online at 360north.org. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, audience. Yeah. And thank you, viewers, for participating in Arts at 360's The Artist. Good night.